When you wake up in the morning, your body is in a very specific physiological state. You've just completed a 6 to 8 hour fast. You haven't consumed any fluids. You've been breathing and losing moisture through respiration, as well as sweating, even in cooler environments. What this creates is a mild but measurable state of dehydration. Now, this isn't always subjectively noticeable. You might not feel thirsty immediately. But the internal metrics tell another story. Your blood plasma volume is slightly reduced. Your hematocrit, the ratio of red blood cells to total blood volume, is slightly elevated. And this matters because when we look at stroke risk, particularly ischemic stroke, which accounts for roughly 87% of all strokes, one of the primary contributors is increased blood viscosity. Thicker blood moves more slowly, is more prone to clot formation, and places a greater burden on the heart and vasculature. This becomes particularly dangerous in the early morning hours, when stroke risk naturally spikes due to a phenomenon called the morning surge, a rise in blood pressure, sympathetic nervous system activation, and cortisol release. Now, here's the part that's both fascinating and practical. Rehydrating upon waking can directly lower blood viscosity. It increases plasma volume, reduces red blood cell aggregation, and makes it easier for the heart to pump blood through your arteries and capillaries. That means improved oxygen delivery to the brain and reduced mechanical stress on the endothelial lining of your blood vessels. Several clinical studies and observational cohorts have noted that individuals who habitually drink water first thing in the morning have lower baseline systolic and diastolic blood pressures and improved measures of arterial elasticity. But the benefits of morning hydration go beyond the cardiovascular system. There is also a neurological dimension to this. Hydration status is tightly linked to cerebral blood flow. When you are even mildly dehydrated, let's say a 1-2% reduction in total body water, studies using fMRI and transcranial Doppler imaging have shown a reduction in brain perfusion, particularly in the prefrontal cortex. This affects cognition, mood regulation, and even motor control. So when we're talking about stroke prevention, it's not just about preventing a clot. It's also about supporting optimal perfusion to the brain so that brain tissue remains well oxygenated and resilient under stress. In fact, there's an entire regulatory loop involving the brain and the cardiovascular system called the brain-heart axis. This loop involves autonomic regulation of heart rate, vascular tone, and blood pressure via regions like the medulla oblongata, hypothalamus, and nucleus tractus solitarius. These structures are highly sensitive to blood volume and pressure changes. When hydration improves, the feedback they receive is more balanced, allowing better control of systemic vascular resistance and cardiac output. This system, when chronically dysregulated, say, by habitual dehydration, can begin to contribute to atherosclerosis, arterial stiffening, and eventually increased stroke susceptibility. Let's talk about the actual protocol. What should you do? The recommendation I often give is to consume around 16 to 24 ounces of water within the first 10 to 15 minutes of waking. This doesn't have to be done all at once, but it should be intentional. Some people benefit from adding a pinch of sea salt or electrolyte minerals, not for flavor, but to enhance sodium and potassium uptake, which in turn supports cellular hydration and nerve conductivity. This can be especially useful for those who sweat heavily or live in hot climates. There is also a psychological dimension to this practice. Starting the day with hydration signals behavioral intention. It sets a rhythm that aligns with your circadian biology. Remember, hydration also affects melatonin in metabolism and cortisol dynamics. When you hydrate early, you accelerate the flushing of metabolic byproducts like adenosine and support cortisol's peak, which should happen naturally within 30 to 45 minutes of waking. This improves alertness, reaction time, and cognitive clarity, which are indirectly protective as well. Why? Because Poor cognition and delayed responses, especially in older adults, can contribute to falls and injuries, both major risk factors in hemorrhagic strokes and secondary cardiovascular events. You might be wondering whether drinking water alone is enough, or whether certain types of hydration fluids are better. The answer is, it depends on the person and their context. For most healthy individuals, filtered water is ideal. For those engaged in fasting or prolonged low-carb eating, or those with elevated stress loads, incorporating minerals into the water may offer added benefit. Coconut water, herbal teas, or even diluted lemon water are acceptable, but avoid sugary drinks or stimulants early, as they can lead to rebound dehydration or unnecessary vasoconstriction. Also, this isn't just about what you consume, but when you consume it. If you delay hydration until you've had caffeine, the net effect can be dehydration. Coffee and tea are mild diuretics, meaning they increase fluid loss through urine. So if your first drink of the day is a diuretic, you're exacerbating the problem. That's why the first beverage should be water-based, caffeine-free, and preferably room temperature or slightly warm, as cold water can sometimes stimulate the vagus nerve and constrict blood vessels transiently. In stroke prevention literature, there's also compelling evidence that hydration patterns across the entire day matter. But the morning window is particularly potent because it's when the body transitions from its lowest point of cardiovascular readiness to its most active state. That transition is inherently risky. Blood pressure variability is highest in the first 2 hours after waking. So, giving the body what it needs during that fluid, minerals, and light movement is like giving it armor. We also have to think long-term. Chronic dehydration over years leads to cumulative damage to vascular walls, more oxidative stress, and eventually impaired autoregulation of cerebral blood flow. This is one of the underappreciated contributors to vascular dementia, another form of cognitive decline closely related to stroke. So, the habit of morning hydration, while seemingly simple, is a keystone behavior that builds protection layer upon layer. To conclude, when you hydrate in the morning, you're not just quenching thirst. You're actively participating in the regulation of your cardiovascular and neurological health. You're reducing the likelihood of a sudden event like a stroke, while enhancing cognitive performance, mood stability, and overall vitality. It is one of the easiest, most scientifically supported, and cost-effective ways to engage in true preventive medicine. And the data is clear. Small changes, when done consistently and at the right time, create large physiological returns. Every day, the light we receive and the time at which we receive it shapes our biology in profound ways. Most people associate morning sunlight primarily with circadian rhythms, which is accurate and important. But there's a less discussed, though incredibly powerful, function of early daylight exposure, the way it influences cardiovascular and cerebrovascular health. In particular, morning light has a direct impact on vascular tone, blood pressure regulation, and nitric oxide synthesis, all of which are crucial in reducing the risk of stroke. Let's start with what happens at the surface. When your eyes are exposed to natural sunlight, particularly in the first 30 to 60 minutes after waking, it triggers a cascade of physiological responses. The melanopsin-containing retinal ganglion cells in your eyes, specialized light-sensitive cells, detect the blue light frequencies present in natural sunlight. These cells then send signals to a part of your brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is the master clock of your body. That master clock doesn't just control when you feel alert or sleepy. It also regulates hormonal rhythms, body temperature, and, importantly, vascular function. But what's happening in your blood vessels themselves is where this becomes especially relevant to stroke prevention. Sunlight exposure to the skin, particularly UVA and UVB rays, stimulates the release of nitric oxide NO from storage in the skin into the bloodstream. Nitric oxide is a key vasodilator, meaning it relaxes the smooth muscles in your blood vessels and causes them to widen. This lowers blood pressure, enhances blood flow, and reduces mechanical stress on the endothelium, the inner lining of your arteries. Why is this important? Because high blood pressure, arterial stiffness, and endothelial dysfunction are three of the biggest contributors to ischemic stroke risk. And all three are positively influenced by early morning light exposure. What's fascinating is that this mechanism is independent of vitamin D synthesis. In other words, even if you're not making vitamin D, say, during winter months or in low UVB environments, you can still experience vascular benefits from morning light via nitric oxide pathways. In fact, several studies from cardiovascular research groups in Europe and Asia have shown that even 15 minutes of morning sunlight exposure leads to measurable reductions in systolic and diastolic blood pressure for up to several hours. This is significant because the early morning period, roughly between 6 a.m. and 10 a.m., is when the body naturally experiences a rise in cortisol and blood pressure, a phenomenon known as the morning surge. This surge, while normal, can become dangerous in people who are sedentary, sleep deprived, or genetically predisposed to hypertension. Morning light helps buffer this spike and provides a smoother cardiovascular transition into the day. But light doesn't only work through nitric oxide. There's also a neuron-endocrine pathway. Exposure to morning sunlight suppresses melatonin in production while increasing cortisol in a healthy, rhythmic way. This rise in cortisol, when aligned with light cues, helps regulate the autonomic nervous system, balancing the sympathetic and parasympathetic branches. A well-tuned autonomic system means your heart rate variability improves, your vascular tone becomes more adaptable, and your baroflex sensitivity, your body's ability to stabilize blood pressure, functions optimally. On the other hand, people who avoid sunlight in the morning or who spend their early hours indoors under artificial light often experience circadian misalignment. This misalignment leads to chronically elevated nighttime cortisol, disrupted sleep, and increased sympathetic activity in the morning, all of which are correlated with higher stroke risk. Simply put, not getting enough morning light doesn't just make you feel tired. It creates a biochemical environment more favorable to vascular damage, inflammation, and plaque formation. Let's also discuss light's role in inflammation, which is a critical component in the progression of atherosclerosis, the thickening and hardening of arterial walls that underlies most strokes. Morning sunlight has been shown to modulate cytokine profiles, shifting the body away from pro-inflammatory states like elevated interleukin-6 and TNF-alpha, and toward more anti-inflammatory patterns. This immunomodulation is partially due to cortisol entrainment, but also due to localized effects of ultraviolet light on skin immune cells. In terms of practical application, the recommendation is simple but non-negotiable. Spend at least 10 to 20 minutes outside in natural sunlight within the first hour of waking. No sunglasses unless medically necessary, no glass window between you and the sun, just direct exposure. If you live in a location or season where sunlight is minimal, you can use a 10-0 lux light therapy box placed at eye level. However, while this mimics some of the circadian benefits, it does not trigger nitric oxide release in the same way natural UVA does. So whenever possible, prioritize real light. You don't have to stare at the sun. In fact, you shouldn't. Just being outside, walking or sitting, with your eyes open and receiving ambient light is sufficient. You can combine this with other morning habits, stretching, walking, journaling, or simply breathing, to create a compounded health benefit. It's a keystone behavior, one action that triggers multiple positive physiological pathways at once. There's also a timing element. The earlier you get sunlight after waking, the stronger the signal to your brain and body that it's time to be alert and ready. This strengthens your circadian rhythm, which in turn regulates nighttime melatonin, improving your sleep. And better sleep lowers systemic inflammation, improves glucose regulation, and enhances repair processes, all indirect factors that reduce your risk of cardiovascular events, including stroke. Finally, let's touch on mood and cognition. Stroke survivors and at-risk individuals often report depressive symptoms or cognitive decline even before an event occurs. Morning sunlight boosts serotonin in levels not just through circadian alignment, but also via direct stimulation of serotonin, producing neurons in the RAF nuclei. Elevated serotonin enhances mood, focus, and neuroplasticity. And serotonin is the precursor to melatonin, meaning the better your morning light exposure, the better your ability to fall and stay asleep at night, which is, again, deeply protective of long-term brain and vascular health. In summary, morning sunlight is not just a lifestyle tip, it's a biological necessity. It activates nitric oxide for vascular flexibility, aligns your circadian rhythm for hormonal balance, supports autonomic stability, and enhances mood and cognition, all of which contribute to a powerful, evidence-based reduction in stroke risk. And it's free, available every day, and profoundly effective when done consistently. If you want to reduce your risk of stroke and improve your mental clarity, cardiovascular strength, and mood regulation, get outside in the morning. Nature has already given us the most powerful medicine. It starts with light. There is a powerful yet underutilized tool available to all of us each morning, and that's movement. Not vigorous exercise, not intense training, just intentional movement, done early in the day, within the first 60 minutes of waking. The reason this is so significant has to do with how our cardiovascular system wakes up. Upon rising, the body undergoes several physiological shifts: an increase in sympathetic nervous system activity, elevated cortisol, and a spike in blood pressure known as the morning surge. All of these changes are normal, but they carry risk, especially for those predisposed to hypertension, vascular stiffness, or clotting. What early movement does is regulate, redirect, and smooth out those shifts. It primes the cardiovascular system to handle the day's demands more efficiently. This begins at the level of endothelial function. The endothelium is the inner lining of your blood vessels. It's not just a passive surface, it's an active organ that releases molecules like nitric oxide and prostacyclin, which help keep the vessels open, smooth, and protected. In the early morning, this endothelium is highly sensitive to signals. Movement, especially rhythmic movement like walking or stretching, increases shear stress across these vessels. That's the frictional force from blood flowing more rapidly over the walls. When that happens, the endothelium responds by releasing protective substances, relaxing the arteries, and reducing inflammation. This is crucial for stroke prevention. A stroke, particularly an ischemic stroke, often results from a clot that blocks blood flow to a portion of the brain. If the endothelium is dysfunctional, which can happen from chronic inactivity, high blood pressure, or oxidative stress, it becomes more prone to clot formation. But if you move early in the morning, even gently, you're actively training your endothelium to stay supple and responsive. You're telling your body, maintain flow, prevent buildup, stay open. Now, let's look at the autonomic nervous system. When you begin moving, you activate a balanced interplay between your sympathetic go and parasympathetic slow down systems. Morning movement done right, that is, light to moderate intensity, stimulates the vagus nerve, improves heart rate variability (HRV), and stabilizes baroreceptor sensitivity. Baroreceptors are pressure sensors in your blood vessels that help regulate blood pressure. When they function properly, your body can adapt more quickly to stress, postural changes, or sudden shifts in demand, all things that can otherwise provoke a dangerous blood pressure spike. Even more fascinating is how early movement resets the cardiovascular rhythm for the rest of the day. Studies show that individuals who perform physical activity in the morning have a different blood pressure profile compared to those who are sedentary. Morning movers experience a smoother rise in blood pressure, a quicker return to baseline after activity, and more stable readings throughout the day. That stability is protective. Variability, not just high numbers, but wild swings in blood pressure, is a strong, independent predictor of stroke. So, what we're really doing here is training the body to regulate itself more precisely. There's also the role of movement in improving glucose metabolism. Insulin resistance and blood sugar dysregulation are major contributors to vascular damage. When blood sugar is high and poorly managed, it causes glycation of proteins in the blood vessels, essentially making them stiff and prone to plaque buildup. Morning movement, particularly done in a fasted state, helps improve insulin sensitivity, clear residual glucose from the bloodstream, and reduce inflammatory markers like CRP and IL-6. This has downstream benefits not only for your cardiovascular system, but also for brain health, since the brain is highly sensitive to both glucose spikes and vascular inflammation. Let's talk about the brain-body loop. Movement, especially in the early hours, increases brain-derived neurotrophic factor BDNF, a molecule that supports neural plasticity, learning, and resilience. What does that have to do with stroke? A lot. Because stroke isn't only about prevention, it's also about recovery. Individuals with higher baseline BDNF levels tend to recover more fully from neurological injury. Early movement habits increase baseline BDNF levels over time. They build a brain that's not only sharper but more durable under stress. This is neuroprotection in action. Importantly, this morning movement doesn't need to be intense. In fact, it shouldn't be, especially for people who are just starting or managing blood pressure issues. A brisk walk, 5 to 10 minutes of dynamic stretching, mobility drills, or even light yoga. All of these are appropriate. The goal is activation, not exhaustion. You're waking up the neuromuscular system, improving blood flow to the brain, stimulating the lymphatic system to flush out metabolic waste, and setting the tone for stable energy throughout the day. High-intensity exercise can be done later, but gentle movement in the first hour, that's a non-negotiable if stroke prevention is your priority. You may also combine movement with breath work, which amplifies the effects. For instance, nasal breathing during walking can further stimulate the parasympathetic system, increase nitric oxide production, and enhance cardiovascular efficiency. This kind of dual stimulation, movement plus respiration, is a multiplier, not just additive in its benefits. There's also an emotional and psychological layer. Movement in the early morning enhances mood, reduces anxiety, and improves motivation, not only through BDNF but also by increasing dopamine and serotonin in activity in the brain. Dopamine is particularly interesting here because it is involved in habit formation and reward. The more you anchor movement into your morning routine, the more your brain begins to crave it, and the more consistent you become. And consistency is the key, not one great workout, but daily, gentle signals that tell the body, stay resilient, stay ready. Let's not forget circulation to the brain itself. One of the subtle dangers of prolonged sedentariness, especially early in the day, is reduced cerebral blood flow. If you go from sleep to sitting to working without any activation, your brain is underperfused. Over weeks and months, this can contribute to brain fog, poor memory, and cognitive fatigue, all of which increase the likelihood of errors, falls, and accidents in older individuals. Movement gets the blood to the brain. It lights up the motor cortex, the cerebellum, and even activates visual, spatial areas through posture and gait coordination. Lastly, morning movement builds rhythm, biological rhythm, circadian rhythm, cardiovascular rhythm. And humans are rhythmic creatures. Our physiology works best when it operates on predictable, repeating cycles. Early movement anchors the day, lowers vascular resistance, and allows you to meet mental, physical, and emotional demands without pushing your system into chaos. And when your system is calm but alert, your risk of sudden cardiovascular events like strokes drops dramatically. In short, early morning movement is not just a warm-up for the body, it's a calibration tool for your entire vascular system. It sets the pressure, tunes the rhythm, clears the path, and over time, builds a brain and body that are more resilient, adaptive, and resistant to breakdown. So, whether it's 5 minutes or 30, make it a part of your morning every day.